Welcome, everyone, to our closing class of the head-scratching sayings of Jesus. This is session 6. It's been quite an interesting journey through a variety of topics, and today's is no less challenging. It may, in some ways, be the most challenging, because our text for today addresses something, or it points us to the history of anti-Semitism within Christianity, really. And by saying Christianity, I don't mean all Christians, of course, but I do mean within Christian nations throughout history. They have used texts like today to warrant some absolutely horrific behavior towards Jewish people. And I wanted to start today by way of an illustration that some of you actually may be aware of already. I don't know if we've talked too much about this before. I think we did when we read, when we covered Genesis and Exodus, particularly Exodus years ago in Bible study. But anyway, it's the idea of this stereotyped view of within, Christianity in particular, that the literal idea that held sway up until the 20th century, and maybe some of you have heard this, but many Christians believed that Jews were born with literal horns. Had any of you heard that? It is something that is a thing, and it comes from somewhere. And I wanted to use it as an illustration to kind of connect some dots that I think gives us some real potential insight, and certainly reminds us of how important it is when we study how we read Scripture and how we apply it. Okay, so this idea that Jews have horns, it comes from, let's see, the text originally is in Exodus chapter 34, verses 29b. I'm going to take you to just a little brief write-up I did here on it. So let's see if we can move some of these. There you go. So it starts with this story of Moses being given the 10 commandments on the top of Mount Sinai, and he's coming down with these 2 tablets to convey the message to the people at the bottom. But as he's going down, it talks about how he didn't know that the skin of his face shone. Okay, and that word shone is in Hebrew karan. Okay, karan means shone, or it's translated as to become radiant. Okay, so that's how it was intended to be in Hebrew. But as translators were looking at this, and you may have heard this before, within Hebrew there are no vowels. Okay, so Quran is connected to the word keren, all the same consonants, but keren is a Hebrew word meaning horn. Okay, so early translators, the early Greek translators that created the Septuagint, the earliest sort of Greek text that we have, it translates this passage as Moses kind of coming back, and he doesn't realize that his face was shining with sort of the glory of God, that the word has to do with the glorification of God. But later, in his translation of the Latin Vulgate, which is what, the 4th century, 5th century, roughly, when Jerome was writing that. So he took these Greek texts and he translated it as, and this is pertaining to Moses, he did not know his face had become horned. Now, before we go too far with that, there is nothing sort of necessarily bizarre about it. And in fact, if you've been to Italy, or if you've seen, let's see, Michelangelo's horned Moses, there's a picture that he's of Moses with horns, but it's more like beams of light, or oftentimes it's beams of light coming from Moses' head. Okay, or sometimes it is with horns. Now, initially, this was not intended to be this stereotyped, this horned, this sort of like goat-like nasty creatures, not at all. And in fact, it was an association of whether horns of light or just this idea that within many Gentile cultures, Greek, Roman cultures, there were many gods with horns. And so to present Moses in this way was to present him as a person who had divine power or divine assistance in fighting evil. So Moses with horns in early presentation would have been Moses with power, okay? But this is the thing, this is where it comes from. But here's what happens. Because as we move through the Middle Ages, and we get to these things that you may not have studied for a while, but you've probably heard of, like the Spanish Inquisition, or you look at the history of Italy when they created that. This is where ghettos were created, and they literally, and ghetto in Italian has to do with the word foundry. They moved all the Jews to one area on an island to get them out of the areas of Christianity. There's a lot of ghettoization, radicalization, othering of Jews within Christianity. And it happens in part as we move forward. You see this idea of the Moses horned, but then you also see within Christian iconography this connection of horns with the devil. Mm-hmm. Okay, and that didn't originate in the 10th century or there. It originated back with earlier writers, Milton, Paradise Lost, and Dante, and all these things, these associations like that. And so what you find is you get this connection, and then it draws on passages like today's passage from John chapter 8, which talks about where Jesus uses language that says, to the Jews, you are children of the devil. And you can see where connections get made and dots that were never originally intended necessarily get connected. And historically, then, that became motivation for so much of the hatred that we've seen. And you can go through and you see that it is fairly consistent through the last 2,000 years of Jewish populations being ostracized, persecuted, and killed because of their Jewishness, because of stereotypes and attitudes like this. Now, the truth is, the vast majority of Christians, whether historically or now, are not intentionally anti-Semitic. Okay? We don't go out looking to find how the Bible might denigrate Jews or any populations. But here's the rub. Much like how racism and classism and sexism and all the isms work, they're so around us that we don't often see them. They're sort of there, and we don't even know to question them because they're so enmeshed in our way of being in the world. And that makes it that much harder. So that when we're confronted with, say, maybe ideas that we have, maybe, and I brought this up because I had read of people in the 20th century, and maybe some people in our histories, in our family histories, who were surprised when they found out that Jews actually didn't have horns. Okay, but and that's an extreme case of stereotyping. Okay, but what often happens when our stereotypes are confronted, we at least initially get defensive rather than open to a new possibility. So we'll say, well, I don't think the passage means all Jews. Or we say things like, well, I'm just quoting what Jesus is saying, instead of going to that place of saying, you know what, I want to question that. I want to face that because I want to grow. I want to be better. And what I hope, one of the things we've gleaned from this class is that as we look at Jesus and as we look at these difficult stories, what we see is a consistent pattern of through what appears to be a really challenging text, Jesus is still wanting us to be better and to grow. And that somewhere in this, there may well be good news. So this is what we're hoping to look at today. What I presented is a fairly large topic. We're going to try to focus on the context of this passage today, and maybe have some room for a broader conversation. But I felt like that was just not only an interesting example, but a powerful example of the ways in which translation, Bible story, and culture can really get intertwined to create some very powerful narratives and some unfortunate historical results. So that's my opening salvo, I guess. Any reflections on that, or just comments in general before we get into the reading today? Carol.
I had always heard of the Shekinah of God. Is there a connection between those two words?
The Shekinah?
Glory of God.
Oh, the glory of God. That, yeah, I mean, there's various words that pertain to one another expression. In this case, the word is Karan or Panav. That would be the Hebrew. So Shekinah is definitely a Hebrew word, but I don't know if they're, how it might relate, in terms of our translation of it. Patty?
The whole book of John is so different than the synoptic gospels, and it's different than some of the other ones that aren't in the Bible per se. And so one of the things I always go to is who really wrote this and what was their point of view. And it presents a Jesus that is saying, I'm the Son of God. I am he. You have to believe that I am he. If you don't believe that I am he, you're going to be in trouble.
Yes.
And that's and so I wonder who's talking. I wonder who's talking, and yes, what happened to them that they're talking that way. So, because we can say Jesus is in there somewhere, but I'm not sure where it is.
That's right. And not only who is talking, but to whom are they talking? We often think of these gospels as being intended for this universal audience when they're written for a particular community. And that's very important. Okay. So when Jesus is saying things in the Gospel of John, like, I am the way, the truth, and the light, no one comes to the Father except through me, is that meant to be a universal statement for all people of all times? Or is it spoken specifically to the group to whom the gospel is written?
Right.
I'm not here to answer that particular question right now, but it sure matters, doesn't it? It sure matters. And when we studied the Gospel of John, we did go into that. And I don't know if we have that one on video yet. Maybe we'll have to revisit some of these, because as we redo some of them and get them on Zoom, it's kind of nice to have the, the collection, the historical conversations here. But anyway, that's a very important question. And that's what's challenging about the Gospels. We don't always know. We don't always know, since we don't know who really wrote them. There's no autographs on them. We're guessing the time. We have a sense, we have windows of time that seem accurate. There's a lot of references within them and language type styles and usage that helps hone in, but it's not easy to pinpoint some of this stuff. So that remains a challenge, but it's a very important question and consideration.
And the other piece of it that's interesting to me is that this gospel says that the real person who's behind all of this is the disciple whom Jesus loved.
Right.
And that's really crazy. I mean, it's really interesting. It makes it, why did he do that? The person who wrote this, why wasn't it his voice? Why was it this other voice? And who was that person? And we don't know who that person, we think we know who that person was, but we're not sure. And I always wondered if it was a woman.
It might be a woman. It might be a mystery person. It might be the reader or the hearer of the gospel. There's so many ways that we are not necessarily granted access to all of those types of meanings, which then means instead of coming at it like we know all the answers, that's where the humility, I think, is so vital. And that's where I just get, sometimes it's nuts to me how ardent we can get in what we think the Bible is saying. And that's why oftentimes many are accused, and probably rightly so, of making the Bible mean whatever they want it to.
Yeah.
Okay. The Bible is sort of malleable like that. And it's unfortunate. And that's the rub of today, is that we have made texts like this one into our referendum against Jews. Okay. Historically. And that's challenging. That's Well, we'll get into it. We'll get into some of that. Any other comments or questions before we get into the reading? Yeah, Horty.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, gotcha.
Can you hear me now? For me, the benefit of this entire study group that we've been working on, for me was personally summed up in something that you said in one of the early sessions, and that there's the possibility that many of these things were at least put into my life to help me raise questions about whatever it is that's going on. And as soon as you said that, it became a new lens for me. When something came up as a question or something came up as a criticism or something, I flipped that other lens on to say, maybe not, maybe so, maybe I don't know. Maybe it's not knowable. Maybe it's maybe. And so for me personally, the benefit of this entire study, as interesting as it has been with the particulars of what we've studied, has been the concept of this lens.
Yeah.
That I feel has really been an awakening in the possible purpose of things that seem confusing or even negative, to maybe broaden my participation in the universe.
And I think that's a helpful course. And I'm glad that a course of action. I'm glad that that's one of the things you've found sinking in. And that idea that when we look at these things, it's often not about us trying to, interpret it and accept it at this sort of face value, black and white, but sort of really get in there and examine if we accept, and this is one of the things that we've looked at in the teachings of Jesus. He is always looking to build up, to transform, to use whatever tools necessary as a teacher to wake up his audience, both within the story and those like us experiencing it externally, to wake us up to our own prejudices, our own stereotypes, our own limitations, our own obstacles, our own obstinance, and then move us through that and beyond that by whatever means necessary. So if we accept that, then there is teaching value beyond the face value of what's presented most often. And I think we've seen that. And the more we see that, the more we know it, and the more we're ingrained with this idea that there's more that meets the eye to this text, perhaps. And that healthy perhaps, or that healthy maybe, as you were talking about, Horty, is one of the greatest gifts we can give to ourselves and to the world. Because ardent certitude, this is a Fred Rogers quote, this idea that ardent certitude within faith, within all religions, is one of the greatest sources of human pain and tragedy. Okay. And I know that a lot of us long to find certitude in our lives. And a lot of us come to church, not necessarily at this church, but we go to church at some point in our lives to find answers. And we want that. We're hungry for that. We're humans. But I don't know that the Bible was intended to be a book of answers, and more about something that broadens us and breaks us open and helps us to ask better questions. So good stuff. Thank you. Anyone else before we get into the reading?
I'd just like to say one more thing.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
And it just came as you were talking, and that's that I've always seen the incarnate Jesus in a singular way as the focus of the story. But when you're talking about breaking us open, I feel like this experience of bringing God to us in a person, maybe, isn't just about Jesus. It's about what God did to help us. It's about an interaction, and that glory or horns or whatever it is reaching out to us, and we're being brought into it. because of this person and how he touched everybody else in a kind of rippling way out. And we're part of the ripple still. And it's also very evolutionary, because this certitude thing is putting us back in, 2020 years ago, 21 years ago. But that's not what it is. It's not going to be, we're not going to have certainty. We're going to have questioning. And the questioning is going to, and I think it's to help us evolve. When he said, I want to bring you life and life more abundant, it's not just about living, it's about being fully human.
Yeah.
And we're not fully human yet. We are fully human and we're not fully human. To be fulfilled, fully whole and holy humans. And so that this idea of Jesus being this single player out here and we're all over here, it isn't like that for me right now because of what you said. It's an interaction that's ongoing, and it's really amazing.
It is. It is. And insofar as we go to that place, or are willing to go to that place of interaction and understanding that we're in a relationship here. Okay, this isn't about just information coming down to us that we download from on high. No, this is about experiential practicing of compassion and love and following and living and bleeding and falling down and getting back up and reaching out to each other to help do that for each other. It's all of those things. And we can easily fall back into the same old categories of us and them and, in and out and all that stuff that every single gospel has Jesus confront. Being religiously certain that I am right, that sort of stuff, that Jesus is confronting and breaking that down all the time. Okay. And yes, when we pull passages out like this, what we're about to read, it's challenging because we're like, well, where's the Jesus we know and love in this? But that's where it's, I think, asking us to lean in a little further and sort of say, all right, well, what is this saying? How does this connect to the whole, the bigger picture? And we may not get a satisfactory answer. Okay. That's what a healthy maybe allows for. It means that for some of us, it's going to be like, oh, yes, that makes so much sense. Yes, that feels right. Yes, that leads me to want to break through. And some of us will say, no, this makes me feel a struggle even more. And it makes me feel confused. And it makes me question. And all of that is still a part of it. Because as we said, and we continue to say throughout this whole class, that's what it means to be a person of faith. That's what the name Israel means. One who struggles with God. So continue to engage in the struggle. That's the invitation, and engage in those places that really leave you, thrown or hungry for more or satisfied or whatever. Just don't stop. Don't sit in one place for too long. Jesus was always on the move. We're invited to be the same. Marilyn, go for it.
Say one thing to build on what you've just been saying. The more years that go by where I'm trying to learn and understand and remember, I become more and more aware that it's when it's a struggle for me that it really changes me. If it becomes too easy, it's kind of in one eye and out the other.
Yeah.
And it doesn't sort of really make a difference to me.
That's right. That's one of the biggest complaints about church for a lot of people. Nothing feels like it's at stake. It's too easy. It's too comforting. Great. You're saying God loves everybody. That's a challenging statement to many when we really take it to heart. But to so many, it's like, no, I need something more. We need more to be at stake. That's how we grow. We need to be challenged. We need the sandpaper sometimes. You got to be abrased. This stuff hurts. It's like heart surgery. It breaks us open and it leaves scars and it leaves us in some pain, but ultimately it brings us towards something that's healthier. And that's the journey. It's one metaphor for it. Maybe there's better ones I could have chosen, but I need 3 volunteers because it's a little bit of a longer passage. I just kind of broke it into 3 parts. If I could get three readers, I'd like to get into the reading now. So Barbara, you'll do the first section. I'll tell you what that is. Thank you. And Patty, you can do the second one. And Bonnie, you can do the third section. Okay, thank you. I will share it So Barbara, if you would read the first two paragraphs here. This is John chapter 8, verses 31. We're going to only read to 50, 53, I think. Yes, only to 53. But Barbara, if you could read these first two paragraphs.
True disciples. Then Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in him, "If you continue in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free." They answered him, "We're descendants of Abraham and have never been slaves to anyone. What do you mean by saying you will be made free?" Jesus answered them, "Very truly, I tell you, everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not have a permanent place in the household. The son has a place there forever. So if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed. I know that you are descendants of Abraham, yet you look for an opportunity to kill me because there is no place in you for my word. I declare what I have seen in the Father's presence. As for you, you should do what you have heard from the Father."
Thank you. The next reader, I think it was Patty, right? It's this next paragraph here, please, Patty.
Okay. Jesus and Abraham. They answered him, "Abraham is our father." And Jesus said to them, "If you were Abraham's children, you would be doing what Abraham did. But now you are trying to kill me, a man who has told you the truth that I heard from God. This is not what Abraham did. You are indeed doing what your father does." They said to him, "We are not illegitimate children. We have one Father, God himself." Jesus said to them, "If God were your Father, you would love me, for I came from God, and now I am here. I did not come on my own, but he sent me. Why do you not understand what I say? It is because you cannot accept my word. You are here from your father, the devil, and you choose to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks according to his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies. But because I tell you the truth, you do not believe me. Which of you convicts me of sin? If I tell you the truth, why do you not believe me? Whoever is from God hears the words of God. The reason you do not hear them is that you are not from God."
Okay, and then Bonnie, just up until including verse 53.
The Jews answered him, "Are we not right in saying that you are a Samaritan and have a demon?" Jesus answered, "I do not have a demon, but I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. Yet I do not seek my own glory. There is one who seeks it, and he is the judge. Very truly, I tell you, whoever keeps my word will never see death." The Jews said to him, "Now we know you have a demon. Abraham died, and so did the prophets. Yet you say, whoever keeps my word will never taste death. Are you greater than our father Abraham, who died? The prophets also died. Who do you claim to be?"
Okay. Thank you for that. And so it's powerful to hear the words. I think more than even reading it. But to start us off then, you hear the constant reference, Jesus is talking to the Jews. How, just if you could characterize it, how does this passage, how does the passage characterize the Jews from what you just heard? What are some of the images that come to your mind as Jesus is talking to the Jews there? Carol?
Devilish liars.
Yeah, devilish, like literally, insofar as they can't understand or accept what Jesus is saying, they are from their father, the devil. Mm-hmm. Anything else? I saw another hand. Was it? But it's
I was going to
Yeah.
say something similar.
okay. Bonnie.
It sort of reminded me of people that are so entrenched in their religion and so certain that they're right, everybody else is wrong, that it's almost like nothing Jesus said was going to open up their minds to any other possibility than what they already believe. And they, and so this was a new concept, and it's like, this has got to be wrong. This can't be right because we know what's right.
Yeah. Yeah. There's certainly a sense of that. There's an entrenchment feeling of this, that Jesus, at least the words that are being expressed in this passage, are very much leaning into a wind, a high resistance for sure. Any other comments about how the Jews are presented in this? Yes, Boyce.
Words that came to my mind were non-believers and non-followers.
Yes, non-believers, non-followers. Okay, good.
And there are people that don't get it, just like the disciples.
Well, it's funny you say that, because in some ways I agree with you, but it's more than just not getting it. It's about practicing. It's about a decision. It's about something more than than ignorance. The way it's characterized, they're very much kind of like more the cross-armed resisting types. You know what I mean? That step up from just not getting it. But it's connected to that for sure.
Well, I say that because they refer to Abraham died, so you're going to die, and we're going to die, rather than understanding that there's extended living if you believe in the word.
And did you all notice, speaking of some of the language that was used, did you notice the nearly comical reference at the beginning when the Jews say, "We've never been slaves"?
Yeah.
As if they didn't go to Egypt.
As if none of that as if they were completely unawares. Okay, that's a very, very powerful statement and a ridiculous statement in some ways. Okay, but it may be a rhetorical statement. Something that it may be very intentional to say it like that. But I hope you noted that, or as you go back, pay attention to the words that are put on their mouths. That's it's kind of over the top. It's meant to be shocking. It's ridiculous, because anyone who's a Jew, that's the foundational story. Okay, but here's the next question. So we have basically, like, we can agree on this. It's not a very complimentary picture of the Jews. Okay, but here's another thing. If you didn't know anything about Jesus, okay, I don't know if this is possible, but let's just pretend. If we didn't know anything about Jesus, would you be able to tell from this passage that Jesus himself was a Jew? I don't think so.
Mm-mm.
Look at how it's pictured. It's always about them. You, he's talking about. Jesus, well, maybe there is. I'm open to that. It's hard, though. It seems that the passage is really creating a distinction here. And yet we know for a fact that Jesus was a Jew. But that's when they call him, it's an interesting statement there too. They call him, you're like a Samaritan who's possessed by a demon. He doesn't address the Samaritan part. And all that is a reference to the fact that the Samaritans were sort of Jewish blood, but mixed blood and mixed practices. So they were sort of the Jews of the Gentile world, right? The ones who had embraced some of the other house gods and nation gods when they were taken away to Assyria or other places, and they came back, and maybe they didn't have pure practices like the real Jews had. Okay, so that's the whole Samaritan thing. But it's interesting how it really does seem to distance Jesus in this passage from his Jewishness. Patty.
I know you're saying that this is Jesus and the Jews, but these are Pharisees he's talking to.
Well, that's that's the next point.
The Pharisees have a lot of influence over the Jews. And so, but to say that all the Jews felt that way, I mean, you're not saying that, but to just, when I hear it that way, I don't hear it that way. These are the Pharisees, and they're really threatened by Jesus because people are listening to him. But it's also interesting because when Jesus goes back to his own community, his community thought he had a demon too.
Right.
So it's not just the Pharisees who are having trouble with this message.
Right.
This message was radical in terms of the history of the Jews.
Right.
Which forgot that these people forgot they were slaves because they were focusing on right now, probably. But the bottom line is Jesus is bringing them a message that they've all got it wrong. And they need to open their eyes and have eyes to see and ears to hear. And that's really threatening to people who are in power.
Yes.
And threatening to the people they influence because it destabilizes everything.
Now, what Patty is talking about, she brings up, was what I was going to go to next anyway. So thank you. But it's this whole idea that many translations have taken this. When we read that passage, it was in the NRSV, it was a very consistent reference to the Jews. But there are indications, and some translations and some translators don't just say the Jews, but they do say religious leaders. They don't always say, it's not just the Pharisees, but sort of the religious leaders or the religious elite. Okay. If you substituted that for the ones whom Jesus is calling children of the devil, does that alternative help at all? Do you find that helpful to think of it like that? Go ahead, Patty.
My translation identifies Pharisees, and
Okay.
it does help me because it helps me to see an individual group who has specific ideas. And when they say Jews is just too much diverse because, the Pharisees had more exposure to religious texts than many of the other people, and also to the process of determining what was right and wrong. But the general population was just trying to make a living. They were all being taken over by too much taxation, and they're not thinking about these things.
Right.
When I see the Pharisees thinking this way, I can see myself as somebody who's studying with you guys as being a group that has a different identity than people who aren't studying or who are Buddhists or whatever group. So it helps me to see he's talking to a group of people who have authority over others, who have power over others, who have influence over others, and who've gotten it wrong from his perspective.
Yeah. Now, the word in Greek that's translated as the Jews or sometimes as religious leaders or Pharisees is a word that I'm not going to go into too much detail. It's roughly pronounced iaudeoi. And the challenge is there are many instances where it does mean the Jews. And then there are some that seem to point to religious leaders. So it's not so easy. So while it's helpful, I think it can be, and I think that's what we would say, maybe, is that it is helpful to think of it in the way Patty just said, that it's okay. He's speaking not just to all Jews, but he's speaking to the ones that hold power and hold sway and whose ideas really seem to be the hard-headed ones that Jesus is always bumping into, right? It makes it very much easier to kind of grasp this. And yet, it's also important to just say, okay, but it may not be. And the way this passage has been used has kind of been broader in terms of its historical implications. So while it's helpful and I think important to consider that translational difference, it's also important to just not dismiss the other possibilities, the more difficult possibilities. So then when Jesus says to whoever he's talking to, whether it's the Jews in general or the religious leaders, when he calls them the devil's children, to say that in the context of the way it reads, it's easy to sort of look at it and be like, well, if you're the child of the devil, you're basically predisposed to act like the devil. It's hard to break out of that. That's just who you are, That's how a lot of people see it. And that, again, feeds some of the long-term stereotypes that have played out in history. But when you hear those words, you are children of the devil, you're the devil's children. How do you understand them? What do you think Jesus is getting at here? Bob?
Well, to me, Jesus is saying, you want to kill me. Therefore, you don't know God.
Yeah, and that's, to me, that whole line, that you want to kill me, it can point us towards the ones who have the power, like, oh, well, it's clearly about the religious leaders, right? That's the ones who want to kill him. But then you have these odd passages in like Matthew, where the Jews who are standing out there say, oh, crucify him, his blood be on our heads, that sort of thing. And it's just like, whoa, okay? And all of this stuff is at play in here. So yeah, he's talking about the ones who want to kill him, the ones that just don't get it. But how do you understand Jesus' words? Or even take it one step further. If the author of John's gospel, we'll call him John because it's easy. But if the author of John's gospel knew how this passage was used throughout history, how do you think he would react? I'll start with Horty.
Well, I can't answer that.
Fair enough.
I'm,
How do you think?
I'm going to back up to
Okay.
your other question of how does it make me feel? And maybe to keep things less uncomfortable, I found myself, when you ask that question, moving into almost poetic license of I am a child of humanity. I am not without sin. Have in my life, have I ever killed Jesus's word? Have I ever betrayed him? Have I ever condemned my connection? Have I ever been someone to whom this could be addressed? And I would have to say, yep, I don't like it. I don't like it. But I am certainly as human as I believe we all are.
Yeah.
Therefore, as both complex and complicated and resistant to the ideas that Jesus came to bring us from God.
Yeah. Beautifully said, Horty. Thank you. And I do feel that when we read any story, scripture story in particular, it's so important to put ourselves in the shoes of various characters, if not all the characters, insofar as we can, to allow us to discover within ourselves the reflection of truth. Because it is often easy, and maybe we do it again in that unexamined way, where we often put ourselves in the shoes of the protagonist in a particular story or in a particular vantage point. We just find ourselves there because we want to be there. We want to be the good ones, oftentimes. That's natural, but Scripture invites us to all the places, and really, it often does so without judgment. And yet there's a lot of harsh words in this passage that make it maybe harder for us to kind of relate or to want to step into certain parts. But as Horty just said, that is a powerful means of access for meaning in these. Patty, and then Jane.
So Jesus is talking to Pharisees who are very adept, supposedly, in the history of their people. And the history of their people includes the story of Adam and Eve. And the tempter, the serpent, who is seen as a liar, who invited them and told them it wasn't going to be bad if they had the apple. And I see that reference to the devil related to that, because Jesus was using words to to help them change their ideas about God and how God saw things. And so that was one of the highest trespasses against God, that thing. And I see some relationship there, that this would have made them think of that. And that's what the devil is. And they're being called the devil. And that was the first part. That's where human beings came into being. And so there's a relationship there to sinfulness. And that part of that relationship to sinfulness is listening to the wrong message.
Right.
And so that's what I think might be a relationship.
Yeah, calling on some strong imagery and stories of renown that everyone's familiar with, for sure. Yes, thank you. Jane?
So I'm going to go back to the idea of children of the devil.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it's a child of darkness. And for me personally, I do fall into darkness sometimes just by my own attitudes and thoughts and where I let my mind go. And I believe Jesus was trying to point out to them that they were in darkness right then. They weren't seeing what he was bringing, what God wanted for them. And it's a matter of, open heart, looking for light, always looking for the good, the beauty. And so I don't think of the devil very much as a devil. I think of it just as darkness, separation.
Well, and what you're both bringing up reminds me of when we studied the Gospel of John in its entirety. We talked about how many times in Scripture, but really many times in the prophetic tradition, there's a license for something called prophetic rhetoric. And that is that there's this permission that the teachers and the scriptures had to include extremely harsh language intended to wake you up, so that what you just said, Jane, about wanting to welcome people in, it wasn't always just about bunnies and soft blankets, but it was about a punch in the face sometimes, because that's what people needed. And if that's what worked, that's what you did. It's not that it all is that, but you use all the tools at your disposal. So there's this idea of prophetic rhetoric. There's this permission to be very harsh, but here's the deal. It's always within the family. Okay, it's always kind of like we're all in this together still. And the intention is to call back from sin, not to ostracize and say, you're going to hell. You're done. Forget you. It's never really about that. And when we think it is, when we get behind it, we find out, oh my gosh, that's really, that's kind of what we've been seeing. That's what we talked about last week. It's not about damning this group and forsaking that. And, it's about calling people back, waking them up. Okay. Do you think then that this passage qualifies as that type of prophetic rhetoric? Go ahead, Patty.
It's interesting because the very idea that the devil idea is used is so shocking, and it's almost as if it's useful. I mean, it's useful. And if you turn the word devil upside down, it says it's lived. I mean, isn't that totally cool? Yeah. I mean, it's like he's using these shocking ideas to get to life, to living. And I think, who says so? I just thought it just seems like it's a crazy idea, but it seems like what Jesus is doing. He's saying, shake up your ideas totally. And if you turn them upside down, you might find where life is.
Yeah. Yeah. So it very well could be this passage that has this, permission to be extremely harsh, but not with the intention of throwing out a whole group of people, but calling them to something, calling them in, not just calling them out. Here's another thing to consider as we reflect on this passage. So in this time of the first century, okay, this really challenging time, okay, Rome has sacked Jerusalem by the time John's written. it's really difficult to be different. Okay, Rome is putting the clamps down. You got to show fealty to the emperor. You got to pay homage to their gods. You can worship your gods, but you got to pay respects to the bigger picture gods here. Okay, all these other things. Now, in this context, the message that Jesus' followers are preaching about, okay, these Jewish followers of Jesus are preaching about this crucified and risen Lord, that they're saying to all people, to Gentiles, to Jews, to everyone, they're saying, you got to worship this one. You can't keep worshiping all the local gods. And that position would have put a lot of people in danger, especially Jews in general, because whether you followed Jesus or not, you're going to get lumped in with those Jews who are practicing this very anti-Roman approach to doing religion. So it is a tough spot. And to not pay homage to the local gods or the Roman gods, the Gentile gods, was a real risk. Okay, it was a real risk. So there was a lot of resistance about doing it because of fear. Okay, so that reality that was a part of the early context in the first century, how does that kind of background possibly open up some different understanding about this conflict between Jesus and the Jews or the religious leaders in passages like this? It certainly reminds us that there's a lot at stake. There was a lot at stake here, and it's a fearful time. This isn't just like how we do it. It's like, well, I don't like that. I'm going to choose this one, where there's very little at stake in our modern context, at least in America, in terms of the religions that we practice. Although that's not entirely true, is it? We still see a lot of religious violence in this country. But Marilyn, I saw your hand up.
Yes, and I'm not quite sure exactly how to express what I'm thinking, but I think a lot of the time, and I guess this is the right word, there are people who sort of see Jesus as kind of a pansy. I mean, just not really being a very strong person and needing to be stronger and everything.
Like the Salmon, that Warner Salmon painting, right? The one that we all know, the soft, lovely, flowing locks of Jesus. Yes.
Yeah. And there certainly is lots of lovingness in Jesus and understanding in Jesus. But passages like this show him being very strong and forthright about what he believes and where he thinks he comes from, and being upset and accusatory of the people who don't. And even though this may not be exactly how it went,
right,
translated and written by other people and everything with years going by, but nonetheless, it ended up in Scripture, a passage like this. And it seems to me that there's something important about this that I've thought recently, Jesus was really courageous. Look how he allowed himself to be crucified. And I don't very often hear him sort of presented that way.
Mm-hmm.
But in a situation like this, or in how his life ended, he really demonstrated a lot of courage.
Absolutely. And I think we often talk about words like courage, but we don't fully buy or appreciate it, because we don't see him as strong as he was gentle, you know. And he was that healer who wouldn't hurt a fly. And yet he will smack people upside the head, whether with his rhetoric or even literally, if it will get them to open themselves to a new way. He doesn't want to hurt someone, but he wants to wake them up, that sort of thing. And so to me, I love how you just said that, because that is a way of knowing Jesus that's more of that type of Jesus that we would want to follow. Get behind someone like that, because it's courage and leadership that draws us. Being gentle and loving is powerful, but the ones we follow are the ones that stand up and do it. That's why Martin Luther King was so powerful as a leader, because he was in the struggle, and there was a ton at stake, and we see that. And throughout it all, it wasn't just the way his life ended, but throughout it all, there was so much at stake. Jesus is like that. And the picture that we have of Jesus, I feel, is more, we are drawn more towards the truth of who he was when we realize that, when we remember that. And that he did use all sorts of tools for his teaching and for the ways that he tried to wake people up. He wasn't just a sage on a mountaintop that you come to ask your questions. And I'm not belittling that. There's a place for that. But he used all the tools. It's an important thing to remember as we continue to walk. Go ahead, Marilyn.
And just to build on what I was saying a little bit more, look how 2,000 and some years later, we're still talking about his interactions with people and the sorts of things he said and what it is that surprises us. And it seems to me if he had ended up being the Solomon kind of figure only, that his influence and his presence wouldn't still be an important feature of Bible study like it is.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Yes, Patty.
Richard Rohr is one of my favorite theologians, and he talked about addiction as being a basis for sin, and especially addiction to the things that we think are true.
Yeah.
That we get, that until we can allow ourselves to even believe that what we most think is true is maybe not, and be in the position of humility there, we can do terrible things upholding our side. And that we often don't even know that. We think we're right. And so that's the addiction, the connection to sin and addiction that he was talking about. And this is what I think was going on with Jesus, that the sin of any group of people, the Jews who think they've got it and know what they're talking about, and any of us who think we've got it and know what we were talking about. One of the things about Martin Luther King is that he seemed to know that he was going to die, but he knew what was coming, in a sense, in terms of his faith, and it freed him from I don't think it freed him completely from fear. It certainly didn't free Jesus completely from fear, but both of them lived what they kept their allegiance to God. And so it wasn't as if they died. It isn't a sacrifice that way. The sacrifice would have been giving up what they believed in God. Yeah. It was a way to live until you die, and to keep living until you die, and to keep speaking until you die. It's not about giving up. It's about great courage.
Right.
And both of those did it. And another one who did it was St. Francis. I mean, he certainly was in a crazy place, because he was a playboy before he was St. Francis. And he did some amazing things, going to the Sultan and talking to him and getting him to talk to him. I mean, going through all the territory is just amazing stories of people who have a light, and they see the light and they go toward it, and it's peacemaking, and it's also disruptive to everybody else.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, this passage opens up a lot of conversation, you know, some of it pertaining to the passage itself and what it's talking about within the story, and then what it has wrought in history. And that's the rub. That's why I say it's valuable to see that it may well have been intended for the religious leadership, but the way it's been utilized in history is that it's been utilized to promote stereotypes to dangerous effect. So it asks us then to think about our own connection to stereotypes and our own awareness. You know, have we had stereotypes about other Jews or Christians within our own tradition, the United Church of Christ, are you aware of stereotypes of us? Because there are some. We're called the heretics on the hill for a reason. Okay? Our church in Auburn.
Yay.
People know that. Yeah, exactly. Now, what do you make of that? What's your own awareness of some of these things? Because that's part of it. That's part of what's powerful, is becoming aware. You know, what's your own awareness of the stereotypes that you have or you may know? Carol, and then Bob.
Explain to me what they mean by heretics. What's an example of something they think makes us heretics?
Well, heretic simply means choice. That's all it means. So you had orthodoxy, so there's the right way, and then there's heresy, which is choice. So that really is a power play by the early church, but it's come to mean those who have so-called aberrant views. So in our denomination, we accept gays and lesbian and transgender and people of all different backgrounds openly and lovingly, with no sort of condition. Whereas a lot of churches will take passages from Leviticus and other places and use them as a weapon against certain sexual identities. So those types of things. So sometimes heresy is about your beliefs, sometimes about your practices. That we're a church that doesn't really have creeds. Some in our church tradition do, but at our church here in Auburn, we're not a creedal church. We don't ask you to read a creed, which is like a loyalty statement. This is what we all believe, because belief in our church is less important than practice. Some churches, like an Episcopal church or maybe a higher liturgical church, would look at that as fairly somewhat heretical. So that's the idea. Just choices that are outside of a perceived mainstream.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Bob?
Well, the first thing that came to my mind as being heretics on the hill is that we don't take the Bible literally. We take it seriously.
Yeah, that's one of the sort of mottos within the UCC. Now, taking it literally in some ways, yes, love thy neighbor, love God. Absolutely literal. I think that's one we can all embrace. What that looks like is open for consideration. But yeah, it's that intention to not necessarily, that we put it out there, that we will not necessarily look at the Bible as being all sort of historically, factually, literally true on the face of it, that there's something underneath it that is often communicated that makes it way deeper, way more meaningful. Some people look at that as, that's heretical. You're just picking and choosing what you want it to mean. And the truth is, we might be, but we're all doing that. So what we're trying to do is we're engaging in the struggle to find out how we might make it more Christ-like, how we might live into a more Christ-like vision, rather than some of these visions that have divided us and separated us and killed us for generations, because that doesn't seem to be working. So, yes, Patty.
I think the very idea that God is still speaking is scary to people.
Amen.
Because so much of what I've been taught going through Catholicism, through a religious journey, is the fixed notion of God, rather than the evolutionary notion of us with God evolving. And an evolving God, it means that's not a final target, but one where we engage ongoing. And our answers may come from anybody, may come from people who do not profess the faith in God. Because if we believe that God is in everybody, they're not going to be able to help it. Right. The message is going to come through them. And the more you see of people in different countries and what they've struggled with, like in Guatemala or in El Salvador, those kinds of situations where the whole practices speak to you about how people struggle with suffering and where God is in that and where courage is. And the lines between what's right and what's wrong are very hard to see.
And what service looks like in that instance. Is it just us going in with all the answers and having all the resources and the solutions and the love? No. And if we think that, then we've missed out then we've missed it. And it's about a different vision of what mission work is. It's not a one-way street at all. And that's a very intentional approach on the part of the UCC, that we go in, we offer to teach, we offer to engage in education, but never with the intention of saying, this is correct, this is the right way, and your way is no. It's always to try to enter those spaces with an open heart and an open mind. That is very different than some other approaches. So sometimes considered heretical. If your perspective, for example, and I admit that this might be stereotypical, but it's also very true in many instances, and that's the nature of stereotype, isn't it? But there are many Christians who think that their job is to save souls, to win souls for Christ, and that the intention is we are not doing Christ's work unless we are converting people, and that means getting them to accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior. There's some very sort of concrete measures for what that looks like. And yet that is often a very one-way street. And so that's one approach. And how does that then convey a sense of, the Christ path versus another way? And sometimes you don't know until you see, until you get in and you witness. And I'm not saying that good work isn't coming from all types of mission, but I think it's important to be aware of the different ways to approach, and the ones that dignify and add humanity and sort of power to those who are being served, and allowing a two-way street to happen. It can't just be an imposition of knowledge, and I've got the answers. And that's another thing. We're not an answers church. We're a questions church. Some churches are more answers churches. Within Catholicism, historically, up until Vatican II, it was all about just listen to the priest, if you can understand him since he's speaking in Latin. But just the priest is the communicator of the message. And then you take it in and you go do your thing. Okay, that changed. And then it became much more of a democratic approach. When you open up the language, so wow, we can actually take responsibility for our faith. That's very important. And that's a huge thing within our tradition, is that we each take responsibility for our growth and our faith. Looking at passages like this is just one way we do that very thing.
Mm-hmm.
Marilyn? Oh, I haven't called on Kathleen yet, so I want to go with Kathleen first.
Sure.
And then I'll go to you, Marilyn.
Okay. I was raised in the Congregational Church in Loomis, and I remember well when we became the UCC. And I think it's really interesting how much that when maybe some catastrophe or something happens in the world, in the United States, and our news broadcasters go out and they seek out to find the clergy people to talk.
Yeah.
Anytime I always know when they're talking to a UCC. It's so interesting because the perspective is so much broader, and I swear it's just so interesting. Carrie and I will look at each other and we'll go, well, we know that's a UCC person. And I also remember when Barack Obama got in so much horrible trouble 12 years ago or so with Reverend Wright.
Right. Yep.
And, before anybody knew that, I knew that it was a UCC church. And, then the criticism was just so extreme. So it's not always easy, because I do feel there is such a stereotype of liberalism in theology. Maybe I would put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a taboo word, isn't it? And that's what we get into with stereotypes, is you create these places of taboo and kind of labeling and compartmentalizing. And it happens in all the directions. It's not just being imposed on us, but that's what we're getting at here, is that our awareness of stereotype is both the stereotype that's put on us, maybe as individuals or as a denomination, but the same attitudes that we have toward the other. And the ways that some of those things reflect some truth, but also the way that they distort it. Marilyn, did you want to add to that, or add your, yeah, Go ahead.
No, a little bit different direction, but it's connected. One of the things that I'm so appreciating about today with all of you and the kinds of things we've been talking about and everything is that I find it's reminding me of stories in my own life that that I don't think about all that much, but I think I want to. I'm appreciating it. So the religious group that I have considered until relatively recently, very much the way I think Jews have been thought about historically. That hasn't been true for me, but it's been Muslims. I just have had very negative feelings about Islam and what in the world is Islam all about, and how can the kinds of things I'm seeing happen come out of the religion. And then I started taking great courses on different religions. And when I started really learning about Islam, I was just so taken by it.
Yeah.
I mean, the different kinds of stories and principles and practices were just felt wonderful. And I also became very aware of how indeed the foundation that it comes out of is the same foundation for Judaism and Christianity.
Yeah.
And yet, nonetheless, we can have a real tendency to feel, or if you're anything like me, to feel very negative about Islam, until I really started learning about it. And it made me so happy to no longer be feeling so negative.
Yes.
It was wonderful. I started seeking out other great courses I could take where I could learn more.
But isn't that how it works with when you find, ignorance and stereotypes go hand in hand. And so when what we are fed is something that's like a stereotype or just this broad brush blanket kind of statement, and when we don't really know, we have a choice. We can either continue to hold on to some of those ideas that we've been told that then create distance, or we can do in one way or another what you did, Marilyn, and that is lean in and engage, whether through a course or a conversation or something like that. And it's so critical because that's how we break down. That's how we grow. That's how we discover that there's more to something else than I thought. And if we're honest, we'll see some of those those places where we get defensive or what we accuse them of. We see it within ourselves and in our own tradition. That's the truth. We're no different. The same, Christians in the early days were accused of being cannibals because of the communion story that no one knew because it was a stereotypical understanding. The blood and the body of Christ. What are they? Oh, that's disgusting. So they're persecuted, and that's part of what the accusations were. Blood lie through the Middle Ages of Jews because they had these terrible stories about Jews devouring the blood, mixing it with the matzah for Passover of Christian children. These ideas that we just create that feed our ignorance and unfortunately feed our action in history. And so the more we open ourselves and the more we notice the places where we sort of have these more stereotypical, shallow awarenesses or assessments, that's the invitation. And dare we go there? Well, that's the question that each of us gets to answer. Because there's one of the choice places. Is this faith that I have strong enough? Is it meaningful enough to lead me to those places to break down all my stereotypes, my ardency, to not cross my arms, but to open them and to trust that I am still, that while I give up my defenses and I make myself vulnerable, I am yet making myself capable of growth. And that is what serves Christ. That's how he lived and how he died. The cross is a metaphor for that. As you think about, this whole class, and it's kind of a good time maybe to start kind of wrapping things up here. But as you think about it, what are some of the takeaways? We've wrestled with a lot of stuff, these 6 classes. What are some of the things that will stand out to you that you find yourself kind of coming back to? Bonnie?
I think the thing that I've gotten out of it is to keep on questioning. I mean, I feel like I've had a lot of, struggles going on with, what I always believed in. Is that really factual, or is there more to it? Is there another approach? Are there other ways of looking at things?
Yeah.
And to be open to that. And so I feel like I'm in the process of growing. And so this has been very, very beneficial to me. One thing I was going to say on your last point, though, is Bob and I went to a Southern Baptist church locally for a while. And we really liked the minister there. And the minister happened to have a law degree, but he also was a historian. And so we liked the fact that when he preached, he would bring in history, and he would talk about what was going on at the time that whatever this particular passage that he was preaching on was written. And we thought, well, that's pretty important. I want to know what was going on at the time.
Yeah.
We went on vacation and we came back and the pastor was gone. We're like, what happened? We really like this guy. That did not fit in with their model at all of learning about history. It's like, this is how it is. This is what we believe in. Don't cloud it up with, what the people were, how they were living at the particular time this passage was written, wherever it was. And we thought, well, that's pretty important. It's really important. We didn't stay there, but we went there for a while, up until about the 2008 election, and that's kind of did it for us. But anyway, it's just, I think that's probably not the only place like that. And so anyway, it's I feel like over time, I'm becoming looking at things more broadly.
Beautiful. Thank you. Anyone else? Just the places that you've noticed yourself growing, any takeaways that you might have? Yeah, Barbara.
Well, I guess I've missed a few of your presentations, but out of this, I think that what I get is Jesus continues to call us back in to fellowship with God and with him, and into community. And community means we have to accept each other wherever we are. And that I think is really important. And I need to hear that a lot.
Yeah. And I think we all do, insofar as that's important to us. And that's really one of our choices too. Are these stories calling us out, pointing fingers? Or are they calling us in, embracing? Because it's a different approach, isn't it? And you can take that tact. You can take a different tact to the way we do religion and practice church in the world. But a class like this, it will continually ask us to be aware of what choice we're making, and to decide, what's true. Is the story, the overall story of God in the world, of Christ in the world, one that seeks to divide, separate, destroy? Or is it one that seeks to combine, to draw in, to lift up, to render whole? It's sometimes in the microcosm, it can feel like one and be another. That's part of it. And so there's a humility that will remain. But just the nature of asking the questions, any questions, is one that is a teacher in itself. That we have the permission, not only the permission, we are encouraged to ask the questions, to grapple. That is what it means. If we're not asking questions, then we're not practicing full faith. If we're not struggling, it's not full faith. I don't know what full faith is. I just want to make sure that it's not an either or. We're not on the path of faith as richly as we might be if we're not asking questions. Patty?
For me, the questions that I need to ask most are paying attention to my body when I feel resistance. Because often when I feel resistance, it's because I can't be open. I can't or won't be open. And so one of the things that my takeaway here is that we ask a lot of questions, some of which touch buttons in me, but there's a sense of support in the community that we're working within, a sense of God's presence in that community. And so that allows me to even notice when those buttons are pushed.
Yeah.
And to begin to ask questions about them. Not always, well, I mean, even outside of this group. The practice here goes there. And that's really important to me because I can reference this and I can say, oh, okay. Maybe that's what's happening here. Maybe the devil is present, but we've got to turn him upside down and it's going to be lived. You know, that's just a way to look at it for me. And that's an important thing.
Amen. Thank you. Any other reflections, takeaways, areas that you've noticed yourself opening up, or just where it's been still a struggle, or the places of confusion? Those are all welcome too. Yes, Jay.
I was just thinking in listening to most of your classes and most of the discussions that I think it's made me become more comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Which just is a way of saying, I think I'm becoming more open. Because when I think about it, when I was 40, I had everything figured out and I had all the answers. And then I became 60 and I realized I didn't know anything.
Yeah.
And I think that's just a way of saying, instead of being closed off, I was becoming more open and wanting to learn. So in that vein, I think that's where these classes is a real assistance and a help in becoming more open and getting more comfortable with being more open and uncomfortable. So.
Thank you, Jay. So well said. The path of discipleship is the path of learning. And the path of learning means falling down on the path many times and reminding ourselves, teaching ourselves, practicing in community that our job isn't to have all the answers. And it's oftentimes when we find ourselves in that position, that's a transition point, that, I don't know what I thought, or what I thought is not as certain. And letting go of that can be tumultuous. But much like the surgery metaphor that I used at the beginning, these types of things that can scar us can ultimately lead to our greater health and our strength and our growth as people, and more than as people, individuals, as communities. And that's what changes the world. That's where this stuff, that can lead us down so many different paths, this material, these images, these stereotypes, these attitudes, they can lead us to places of life, or they can lead us to places of death. And much like Patty said, sometimes the only difference is when we flip it and look at it a different way. Well, thank you all for being a part of this ongoing conversation. It is so life-giving. It's so challenging and wonderful. It's some of the best stuff that I look forward to being a part of as a minister. And so you all add the richness that makes the conversations come to life. And I hope that for anyone who has taken the time to watch these presentations, I hope that it does the same, whether you've been an observer or a participant in them directly. Our next class will be after the new year. I thought about doing something for in Advent and Christmas, but it was a little too much given some other plans I have with some teaching opportunities for the church. So we'll pick something up again in January. And so in the meantime, if you've got any kind of topics, and I say this to you who are participating, and again, anyone that's watching, that you'd like to see, go ahead and let me know. And then we can we'll just keep growing into this. This was kind of a fun topic. So it doesn't always have to be, a particular book of the Bible, but then again, it may be wonderful to jump into something either new or something we've done before. So, because it always is, there's always new perspectives that come up. So anyway, until next time, I hope you have a wonderful Advent and Christmas. And I'll be seeing you, of course, but thank you again for your participation, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks,
All of you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Happy holidays.
Blessings.